I bloody love pinball. It almost feels like a God-given right to play these ball-tastic machines of flippering joy. And modern digital machines like this one give you the ability to choose from a plethora of tables at the touch of a button. It's truly magnificent. But it was almost all stopped, just like when they renamed Marathon to Stickers and the entire United Kingdom imploded. Yes, the life of pinball was almost cut short, mainly due to an overzealous mayor, some questionable mechanics, and a seedy underbelly which is still kind of with us today.
Banning things that are fun is not exactly unusual in the history of humanity. In fact, if it's really fun, you can guarantee it's been banned somewhere in the world. How about video games? Yes, a fair few have been banned in various places in the past, and still are today. In Venezuela, you can't get hold of video games that involve the shooting of human targets. Not legally anyway. Brazil still cracks down on violent video games, like the Mortal Kombat series for example, and North Korea doesn't allow the usual citizens to play any games that weren't made in North Korea. Although to be fair, that's sort of a given. But surely the precursor to the video game, the humble pinball machine, is immune to the sort of things that can get a video game banned. Stuff like murder, sexuality, and political statements. I mean, it's a metal ball being flung around a wooden box for goodness sake.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
As is often sadly the case, even in countries we consider not to be so conservative, something as innocuous as pinball has in the past been struck with the massive hammer of the law, and not even for things like racy cabinet art. Specifically, pinball machines were banned in a country where guns weren't, and still aren't. By the way, while pinball machines aren't banned anymore in America, Kinder Eggs are. Mind you, although in the UK guns are massively regulated, up until 2012 there was in ancient law, on the book so to speak, that it was okay to bump off a Scotsman in York city centre as long as he's carrying a bow and arrows. There's a similar rule supposedly applied in Chester, but only if the victim is Welsh, although Chester authorities insist this is an urban legend. In any case, while York's law might have made any Scottish archery enthusiast a bit nervous to pass the bar walls, any risk of death is covered by the more recent law of, not murdering people, even if they are Scottish. Anyway, that's enough meandering. The law that banned pinball machines in America was not archaic and did not involve crossbows. It was all about so-called morality. Pinball machines have their roots in the games bowling and a broader term of ground billiards, which covers a whole bunch of ground-based games wherein a ball was hit by a hammer of a mallet. It was taking the games indoors that would start things moving towards pinball. Sometimes pubs would have a scaled-down indoor version of these games, with wooden pins for the hit ball to avoid. Penalties were given for knocking the wooden pins down. During the 1600s in France, specifically, the billiards tables were very popular. Eventually, to stop the need for resetting the pins, they began to be secured to the board, and holes in the board became the goals. According to the Encyclopedia of Play in Today's Society, edited by Rodney P. Carlyle, Louis XVI was a big fan of indoor billiards, and when he got a brand new table with swanky cue sticks and ivory balls to shoot up a sloped playing area, it was a huge hit. Such a hit that, when the king's brother called it bagatelle from a similar Italian word meaning a decorative but ultimately unimportant item, the design and name kicked off in France. A version of bagatelle using thin metal pins rather than wooden pins for the tabletop game emerged in the 1700s in Europe. Despite it being of European design, it was known as billiard japonais, meaning Japanese billiards. Interestingly, this would also directly evolve into the Japanese game pachinko, a game in which a metal ball is dropped down a vertical playfield for points. By the way, the reason something called Japanese billiards is usually referred in sources as a bagatelle game rather than a billiard game is that on the whole, bagatelle boards are expected to have this curved top on the playfield rather than an entirely rectangular play area. This billiard Japanese game is the first example we have of a tabletop bagatelle type game that does not have the player use a hammer or a cue to hit the ball. Rather, in this example, there is a spring-loaded cue built in. One could argue this manner of playing wouldn't be standardized for bagatelle games until a good 100 years later, when one man decided to claim that spring cue for himself. Now, to the late 1800s, and a US patent of the spring launch mechanism was netted by one Montague Redgrave, a British man living in Cincinnati, Ohio, he submitted a patent application for improvements of the established bagatelle game, claiming his specific design, including the pin arrangement, board incline, the piston, and addition of swinging gates. He mentioned many times in the application this was to create a game of more skill and challenge. The patent was granted in 1871, and tabletop bagatelles started popping up in watering holes in America and parts of Europe. 2 decades later, and over in Pennsylvania this time, one billiard hall owner, Charles Young, applied for a patent of his own. In 1893, his application of a coin and slot machine that used balls and pins was granted. This machine type would allow the insertion of coins to play the game, promising a nice little earner for pub and club owners. And the addition of the pay-to-play mechanic meant that they would come under the scrutiny of those who saw people spending their money on something that they enjoy as bad news bears. To be fair, we have to remember that while the coin slot simply allowed people to pay a little cash in exchange for the luxury of playing the bagatelles, and later pinballs as they of course soon became known, retrospectively there's not a chance that punters didn't sometimes bet wagers with each other or have prize-based tournaments. It's reasonable to assume that bagatelles were used indirectly for gambling, but that's just an assumption. I wouldn't know because in the early 1900s, I wasn't there. Gambling, which had been popular in the States for centuries, just like anywhere, really, was part of a seedy underbelly of crime in many states by the very early 1900s. While affluent gamblers would enjoy the safety of private clubs, poorer workers didn't have so much protection when flinging dice. Desperate to cash in and win an easier life, or maybe literally just get the money to buy his family dinner, it wasn't unusual for a worker to smash his earnings on a rigged game and dodgy off-track horse betting. Poor areas became perfect places for low-morale, high to set up gambling dens, protected by the politicians of the area by sneaking them a bit of cash on the sly under the guise of a licensing fee. Sounds familiar. Here's a full page of various Christian reverends having a pop about the problem of gambling in Chicago in 1894 in the Chicago Tribune. All the reverends writing in seemed to take the most issue with it being something God wouldn't be wild about by virtue of money being the root of all evil, rather than being upset about the poor being taken advantage of. Although Reverend Bishop Fallows here does lament that gambling can make a man's heart as hard as the nether milestone. Reverend Carlos Martin here doesn't hold back at all. Gambling produces evil results. For one thing, it overstimulates the nervous system and legitimately ends in palsy and insanity. Victims of this vice scorch their nature as with hellfire. Other stimulants seem tame after the fierce excitement of this game of devils. Those dog-collared boys did not have any chill, absolutely seething. With America being quite a religious place, those seething pastors certainly had their voices heard, as in 1910 just about all gambling became illegal in the United States of America. It's worth noting that the infamous alcohol ban written in the 18th Amendment wouldn't come into law until a whole 10 years later, in 1919. And with our pin and ball games now coin-operated, the question could be asked, are these games technically gambling? Even before the coin operation was added, there were already strict rules around the use of bagatelles in parts of America anyway. Here's an ordinance from back in 1875 from the Jackson County Banner, decreeing that anyone allowing children to play bagatelle or billiards or any other game will get a fine for each game played. It also threatened fines for the games being kept in the same place that children might congregate. More than 25 years later, the State Herald of Phillips County published a similar ordinance. There's plenty more ordinances of the same published in newspapers across the USA, leading right up to when the first pinball machine as we know them today would be made. Exactly what can be considered the first pinball machine, though, is a tough one. Pinball, meaning this particular manner of game, first showed up around the 1930s, presumably because the games all used pins and balls. But when researching, I was able to find mentions in American newspapers as early as 1898, with this wanted listing for a jukebox or a pinball machine. Pinball written with 2 separate words. According to the online etymology dictionary, pinball is a word from 1907 referring specifically to a game where the goal is to knock down a pin or pins, and earlier it meant a pincushion. The first pinball machine seems to be considered one amusingly called Wiffle. This was released by Automatic Industries Inc. in 1931, but again it's not hugely different to games seen previously. It has the spring lever, or lever, the coin slot, pins and scoring, but it was incredibly popular. Delightfully, the game was created because the Ohio inventor Arthur Palin found an old bagatelle board in his garage and decided to make it a Christmas present for his little girl, Lois, the cheapskate. It became so popular with her friends that he realized he might have a business success on his hands, and that he did. After founding Automatic Industries with two of his friends, the trio could barely make the boards quick enough. But it wasn't until the addition of electricity in these pinboard games that the games would start to closely resemble the pinball machines we know and love today. One W. Van Sosa made a scoring device whilst working for the Patent Novelty Manufacturing Company in New York to be used in a bowling tabletop game called Bolo. This used pins that served as bumpers, and when hit would light up their corresponding bowling pins on the back box. Impressed by this and the popularity of such a game mechanic, pinboard manufacturer Bally took the idea and made it into bumpers. The result was this game called Bumper, released in 1936, which was a board consisting entirely of bumpers that would keep score up on the back box. Pinball manufacturers were probably aware that they were on borrowed time after gambling had become illegal. I should clarify, slot machines were very much in the gambling category, and slot machines are what had reportedly grown a criminal enterprise around them in New York especially. With mobsters fiddling with the odds, they were practically stealing from the common man just trying to get a gambling fix when it came to the aptly named one-armed bandits. By this point, the 1930s, pinball manufacturers would consistently plaster "for entertainment only" or "not gambling" on their flyers, or their machines' coin slots, and that seemed to be enough to keep them out of trouble. But in New York, one mayor hopeful was about to turn all that on its head. Fiorello LaGuardia was quite vocal of his distrust of the manipulation of the slot machine and gambling industry by mobsters, and by extension, pinball machines, and pledged to tackle it as all part of his campaign against racketeering. And as we will later find out, once he was eventually elected, he absolutely did not muck about on that front. But why was he clubbing in pinball with those sneaky slot machines, the likes of which were part of money-grabbing schemes by notorious mob boss Frank Costello, among others? Did the humble bagatelle-based game really have a place in the criminal underworld, even if people did have to put a couple of coins in for the joy of playing? The proof was in the payout. Payouts on pinball machines wasn't a new thing, but they weren't payouts in the traditional sense. To get around the gambling ban, manufacturers of paying out tables would have to do things like make every fifth coin put in the machine go towards a jackpot, which such games tended to call profit sharing, like on this Stevo board game made by A.J. Stevens and Company in 1932. Well, in 1933, the year before LaGuardia was elected, Bally developed an actual payout slot for their pinboard games, one that would dispense an amount of cash according to where the ball landed. The first official one was Rocket, but more would follow, and not just from Bally. There had been payout machines of a type made before, including one which would decant gum or tokens, but once Bally started up with these cash-centric versions, things were about to get real. Pinball machines like Bally's improved Rocket gave punters the possibility of getting 6 payouts on just 1 coin. These machines proved hugely successful for Bally, even though they were arguably gambling machines at this point. Here is an advert listing by Bally in a Memphis, Tennessee commercial paper. Bally does call those Rocket machines automatic pinball games. Payouts on these pinball machines, unlike as expected on slot machines, would not always be cold hard cash. They might be tokens which were expected to be exchanged with the proprietor for cash, which was a roundabout way of evading the gambling ban while also being utterly, blatantly gambling. The law keen to crack down on the gambling problem had parts of America seeing their slot machines being seized and either pushed into a private club or banned outright. And after, that scrutiny was turned onto pinball games. For example, this front page article in the June 1934 edition of the Spokane Chronicle, Washington, with slot machines practically driven out of Spokane, prosecutor Charles W. Greenough today started investigating pinball games. In my judgment, where prizes are given, these machines are gambling machines. Proprietors still needed a license to have pinball machines, but they weren't allowed slot machines at all. By 1936, the conversation around whether pinball machines were games of skill and therefore not gambling was especially loud. Here in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle in January 1936, Oliver R. Pillatt explains in detail the nature of the boards, how pleasing their electronic lights are to players, and how the Supreme Court Justice is in the process of deciding whether to revoke the licenses for them. He also talks about a pinball racket. Pinball games were supposedly frequently used to fleece players out of money, and the same page reports on the grisly nature, how a 28-year-old businessman had been shot to death in his car while transporting 2 pinball machines. I fear for that anytime I move around retro goods, to be fair. This was also around when New York's mayor went absolutely nuclear on those slot machines in his beloved city. Yes, Fiorello LaGuardia was indeed elected as New York's mayor in 1934, and the lad, as I mentioned, did not muck about when it came to the criminal enterprise around illegal slot machines specifically. Not only did he ban them outright, but in a bizarre but none-less effective bit of PR work, had himself filmed utterly smashing the crap out of piles of them with a massive hammer. He also had himself filmed utterly lobbing the machines into the sea. Yes, a government official fly-tipped. Absolute mentalist. Not pinball machines yet, but their days were numbered. In 1939, the not insignificant issue of World War II cropped up, knocking civilians that had barely caught their breath from the last one for 6. In a war-torn world, you'd hope that those who weren't sent to a war zone might at least be able to take their mind off things with a game of chance or two, because let's face it, anyone not sent to the front was missing out on the biggest, highest stakes game of chance there is. Well, no, because it was about to all kick off. In 1941, a federal-level tax was implemented on various gaming devices, which included pinball machines. Owners of the machines needed to be registered with the government and pay a $50 tax on every one of the machines they owned. That being said, the machines themselves were still able to bring in a lot of money for the owners. According to a report by the New York Commissioner of Investigation in 1941, the annual takeaway of all the machines was more than $20 million. And remember, that's in the early 40s. Adjusted for inflation, that's around $405 million. Finally, in 1942, LaGuardia made good on his campaign promises and got pinball machines, even ones that didn't pay out, banned in New York by virtue of being gambling devices. Yes, to repeat, even the ones that didn't pay out. LaGuardia gave an order to the New York police headquarters to raid for any and all pinball machines, just to make sure. Pinball players were duly devastated. Here's an opinion piece in the El Paso Herald in January 1942 by H. Allen Smith. Smith laments that he hasn't noticed other pinball fans complaining about the demonization of pinball, comparing it to golfers lying down silently if the authorities banned the game. If they're going to holler about gambling, why don't they confiscate playing cards? Why don't they confiscate the Yankee Stadium and Madison Square Gardens? If they're looking for devices which might impel people to make bets, why don't they just go out and confiscate the Board of Elections? Oof. Fierce. But in New York, the mayor was so keen to get those evil pinball machines out of the gaze of impressionable youths by making a point of pestering the police to get a move on with those pinball raids. Mayor LaGuardia was quoted as saying, "These machines develop the instinct of gambling in the young and teach them to try to get something for nothing." According to the New York Times, published on the 25th of January 1942, after the ban was announced, LaGuardia personally went to the police commissioner and asked that every police officer who wasn't busy was to be sent to raid locations suspected of keeping pinball machines. LaGuardia's reasoning for a personal push was he was certain that the financial backers of the games were planning a pushback, and as it turned out, he wasn't wrong. By 6 p.m, the police had snagged nearly 3,000 machines and served a grand total of 1,524 summonses. Yes, any establishment known to be carrying pinballs were about to have their devious doors absolutely smashed open by overzealous coppers ready to cart away the offending items, probably while the owners angrily flapped licensing fee documents in their face. I couldn't find out if the owners were reimbursed for their NAB machines or their licensing fee to own them, but I'm willing to bet they were not. And since the first time it went so well, Mayor LaGuardia picked up his massive sledgehammer and again had himself photographed mashing captured pinball machines to absolute bits. I think he enjoyed doing that a bit too much. And obviously, it wasn't just the arcade and amusement owners getting utterly shafted that were upset with this turn of events. The manufacturers and investors of pinball machines weren't best pleased either, and their attorneys for the gaming operators did quickly start looking for a judge who could issue a federal injunction, a court order that would stop LaGuardia's attack on gaming in its tracks. LaGuardia openly mocked the attempt, taking frankly savage potshots at the panicking manufacturers. The main distributors and wholesale manufacturers are slimy crews of tin horns, well-dressed and living in luxury on penny thievery. Wow, rude. By the way, if you're like me, you're British, and wondering what in the utter bobbins a tin horn is, it's a somewhat archaic American slur for someone who pretends to have money or influence that they don't have. used specifically against gamblers. The word supposedly came from a practice among poorer gamblers who used a tin cone to play a popular game called Chuck-a-Luck, rather than a level one which was more expensive. Chuck-a-Luck is a game where you literally bet on what dice combinations will show after they're rolled, so it's interesting that even in a game where you may as well lob your week's earning in the lake, there was a sort of snobbishness attached to what you flung your dice about in. Unfortunately, the attempt to overturn LaGuardia's ban didn't work, perhaps due to the fact that there were more important things going on, such as an entire world war. Priorities. Now, of course, a modern pinball player might scoff at the idea of pinball games being absolutely banned as part of a morality-cum anti-criminal drive. I appreciate that's probably why a lot of you clicked on this video, but there really was a negative feeling around pinball games, and not just because many people would consider them synonymous with slot machines at the time. In the National Banner in 1942, an article about LaGuardia's war against pinball describes a test run by 2 New York Police Department members before they went out to smash shit up. Apparently, 2 electrical engineers tested an unknown machine to see what a skillful player's chances would be of winning. They reported that by merely pulling a wire, the payoff figure would be changed if the operator decided that the number was being hit too regularly. This was what proved it as a gambling machine, and thus illegal. On the 22nd of March 1942, the Philadelphia Inquirer published these pictures of the switches inside pinball machines that allowed owners to switch them from free play to pay to play, and other electrics that would apparently count the wins and make it easier for gamers to lose. To be fair, that doesn't look too good, does it? Maybe banning the humble pinball game in a country where gambling was a racket won by criminals isn't such a daft idea. Pinball machines ended up being banned entirely in many of America's biggest cities, such as Chicago and New Orleans, while other cities cracked down on children playing them. There were also certain rules about how far an establishment had to be from school to own them. In the cities upholding the ban, pinball machines that survived the mass culling had to be slipped into seedy places like pawn shops or underground clubs. The metal in the seized machines, once providing entertainment, would find a second life as bullet and ammunition in the war.
We expect to collect 20 million pounds of old aluminum utensils throughout the country. 10,000 pounds are needed for every fighter plane.
It's odd to think, but parts of cutesy pinball machines like Gottlieb's Flying Trapeze or Bally's Seabiscuit would end up lodged in the skull of some poor bastard on a battlefield. Pinball games enjoyed a bit of a resurgence after World War II, not in New York, mind. They had to make do with just getting absolutely sloshed instead, which I'm sure was much better. In 1947, the first pinball game that looks exactly as us today would expect the pinball cabinet to look finally showed up when electromechanical flippers were added to the board. Gottlieb released a Humpty Dumpty board, which used player-controlled flippers to add a real element of skill to the game. Humpty Dumpty used electromechanical flippers, although prior to this there were instances of flipper-like controls used in pinball, most notably in the 1932 game Double Shuffle, although that used entirely manual big flippers which the player would manipulate 4 at a time to get a ball to the top of the board. Humpty Dumpty, with its novel new way of playing, would be a good success for creator Gottlieb, and it wasn't long before competing pinball creators like Williams and Bally would start creating their own versions. While not exactly easy to beat, those flippers made this more of a game of skill than chance. But that wasn't going to affect New York's pinball ban, apparently. After the 1945 pinball crackdown, the police didn't let up anytime soon. Years later, in March 1949, here's the New York Police Commissioner William P. O'Brien taking a leaf out of LaGuardia's book and smashing these seized pinball machines up with a massive hammer. Absolute lad. This was a couple of years after World War II ended, so this machine probably didn't get made into bullets and bombers. I'm betting it ended up lobbed in the sea again, to be honest.
Of course, if anyone smashed this machine up, I'd be livid. But then it's more likely to get a virus than anything else. Nice segue. So thank you to sponsor TotalAV Antivirus, an award-winning product designed to protect PCs, Macs or smartphones from nasty malware, spyware and other viruses. It's designed to encrypt your data, as well as including a free VPN to protect you from phishing sites and other harmful things that try and steal your data. It runs seamlessly in the background on all devices, meaning that I can get on with my day knowing that my laptop, desktop and smartphones are 100% protected. So rather than smashing your computer to pieces with a literal huge stonking hammer, maybe save the frustration by keeping your devices protected with this great offer. Visit www.totalav.com/nerd70 or click the link in the description to get 70% off TotalAV today.
Pinball machines still weren't legal in New York City until 1976, when one pinball player was able to prove to the city council that pinball machines, now with their flippers and bumpers, were games of skill rather than luck. Obviously keen to get the masses back flicking metal balls over wooden boards, writer and pinball wizard Roger Sharp insisted that the days of unfairly rigged pinball was over. Being an expert pinball player, he was a vocal dissenter of New York's pinball ban, dissent that got the attention of the Music and Amusement Association, and as a pinball expert, the MAA decided Sharp would be the perfect person to defend this vilified game in court. A group of government officials, only one of them publicly open to the unbanning of pinball machines, watched as Sharp took control of Gottlieb's recently released board Bankshot to support his case. After a rocky start, he proceeded to repeatedly beat the machine by very careful and frankly very skilled gameplay. Impressed, the committee agreed to lift the ban. It's worth noting that there had also been police surveys, according to the Newsday paper in June 1976, which probably helped the whole unbanning thing along. The survey showed none of the shady underworld connections to pinball and slot machines that had led Mayor LaGuardia to lob the things in the sea more than 30 years earlier. This survey is what then Mayor Abraham Beam cited as his reason for signing a law allowing establishments licensed to house games of skill to finally add pinball games to their roster. The law also allowed places like movie theatres and restaurants to get in on the action if willing to pay a license fee. With that being said, there's no doubt Sharp was instrumental in bringing the game back to New York and being at least partly responsible for the resurgence the game enjoyed across the states in the following years. In 2022, his fascinating story was made into an award-winning film called Pinball, The Man Who Saved the Game. In some parts of America, the old law still does remain on the books, but just isn't enforced. Just like those crossbow laws. For example, in Oakland, California, it was still technically illegal to play pinball until the old law expired in 2014, but no one had paid that any attention for decades because, come on, it's pinball! Of course, in places where pinball was formally banned, there are still strict rules around gambling and payout machines, but you'd be hard-pressed to find a pinball machine these days that does offer a payout, although ones like Bally's Safecracker do allow tokens to be dispensed, presumably so that about 500 of them can be collected by the player to exchange for the world's shittest knocked-off cuddly minion toy. So, to sum up, the ban on pinball in many parts of America wasn't just moral panic. LaGuardia had very good reason to lump them in with gambling machines, especially before flippers were added. And yes, they were equipped to make punters think they could make a bit of cash while actually rinsing them for their change. With that being said, the machines with promises of payout were the main problem, not the ones meant for the fun of the game. Also, it seems a bit out of order to just lob stuff in the sea when you disagree with it. Else, most of the UK government would have just been launched off Brighton Pier by now. It's easy to look back on our ancestors' shenanigans as moral panic when looking through the eyeglass of the modern world, but to Mayor LaGuardia, I say, fair play, mate. Now who's for a game of pinball?
So there we go. What a story. I'm going to finish playing this magnificent machine because pinball is flipping great. And that's a pun I'm happy with. So, until next time, I've been Nostalgia Nerd. Toodaloo.
As long as you